now we move on to the much-awaited panel discussion titled Navigating the Regulatory Landscape of Data Protection and Artificial Intelligence. So it again gives me great pleasure to introduce the esteemed panelists for today. So if I call out your name, I request you to please proceed to this seating area on the stage. First, we have Mr. Aman Taneja. Mr. Aman is the Principal Associate at Ikigai Law. Next, we have Mr. Kartikeya Raman. He's the Associate Partner at Mazars. Next, we have Ms. Shehnaz Ahmed. She's a Senior Resident Fellow at the Willy Center for Legal Policy. And lastly, we have Mr. Vivek Abraham. He is the Senior Director, External Strategy for India and South Asia at Salesforce. To lead the discussion for today, we have Ms. Shivangi Malhotra, who is an Associate at the DSCI Public Policy and Privacy team. Over to you, Shivangi. Thanks, Deepika, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us here in person today. Before we start with the discussion, I just want to set quick context for why this is an important conversation to have, right? So artificial intelligence and data protection are generally two of the most rapidly evolving spaces, both on the technological innovation front and also on the regulatory front globally, right? Especially with the ease of access to generative AI, to large language models, conversations around innovation, regulation, accountability are increasingly picking up space, right? There's also a lot of interplay on AI innovation, development and its regulation with data protection, because the fundamental bedrock of AI innovation is high quality data, right? So with that, I will ask each of you to give your quick opening statements generally on key considerations that you all think lie at the intersection of artificial intelligence and data protection. So Aman, why don't we start with you?
So thanks Shivangi for having me here. Very happy to be here with this panel. I'm going to keep my opening remarks fairly brief because I think there's a lot more to get into through the conversation. But I think at this intersection of privacy and AI, I think one very important thing to keep in mind is that privacy regulation is AI regulation, right? As we're thinking through how do we regulate AI, etc., I think the data protection and privacy aspect is going to be a very critical part of any regulatory solutions that we come to. Sorry, I was saying the data protection and privacy part of the regulatory puzzle is going to be a very critical aspect of any regulations that we're thinking around AI. In fact, it might address many of the harms that we anticipate with artificial intelligence, right? In terms of your autonomy, your ability to have decisions made about you, bias, fairness, accountability, transparency. Many things that AI regulations talk about actually do find their natural home in privacy regulations. So in that sense, there is already a considerable overlap, and even if we look back to say existing privacy legislations that exist, say take for example the GDPR, it already had thought through situations where decisions about people are being made through automated means and factored in regulations around that and your rights as end users in that context. So there is definitely I think stating the obvious to say there is a strong overlap, but I also don't think that there is any conflict between the two. I think you can develop AI solutions which are privacy compliant, which respect user rights, and that's I think what will be best for all concerned, given that trust is such a big part of any products that you're releasing into the world. So yeah, I'll pause there and others as well.
Kartikeya, why don't we go down the panel?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kartikeya. So as an opening remark, I would like to discuss something which my mentor always used to talk to me about risk when it comes to new technologies. So he used to always tell me that a Ferrari without Ferrari, it's even more than a Ferrari. And now the way it has been taken up, the AI is everywhere. Every single, even agriculture. I was there in GBI Summit recently. I saw innovations and new technology being used in the areas of agriculture, even warehouse audits they were doing using AI. Not to discount the healthcare industry already using it for predictive analysis of whether you have a TB or anything just by scanning whatever your CT scans are. And this kind of rampant use of AI across sectors have led to a greater need of understanding it, seeing it, whether there is a requirement to govern it, and also understanding that how much we need to govern it. So I think the draft bills that we have seen across various jurisdictions, including what my friend said about GDPR, the EU AI Act that just went out. So what we have seen is that there is a very cautious approach. They don't want to stifle the use of AI, but still they want to provide that guardrails where we see that how we can encourage AI using fairness, transparency, other privacy principles, so which are very important. So without taking too much time from the introductory remarks, I would like to hand it over to my next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I actually would want to kind of start off with a question that sort of comes to my mind, essentially, is that can privacy laws actually sort of address all sort of online harms? Privacy laws which are aimed at regulating emerging tech. Now, I personally feel that privacy laws will always grapple with two things. One, the fact that it might not be just adequate to address all sorts of issues around digital rights or digital harms. And secondly, it also has to work in tandem with all laws operating in the digital space. So when we look at data protection principles in the context of AI, sometimes I feel that it's not as straightforward. Like for instance, let's say we talk about fairness, right? When we say in data protection, fairness would perhaps imply purpose limitation, that the data that you sort of are processing is for the purpose for which the user has consented. But in AI, perhaps that has to go a step forward, and you would want to ensure that AI systems do not perpetuate historical biases. When you design AI systems, there has to be participatory approach in designing and implementing, some sort of so I feel the study of this interrelationship between data protection principles and, how AI governance works is very critical. While there might be certain areas like this where, one might see some frictions, but there are also areas where I feel that there is a need to think about how consistency can be achieved. Like for instance, transparency. When we say transparency, to what extent data fiduciary should disclose information, to accountability, to what extent data fiduciary should be accountable, what kind of obligation should be imposed on them. Some aspects of it are there in the data protection laws, but I think other sectoral laws will also perhaps now have to, have some sort of consistency to ensure that, compliance is not hindering innovation. I mean, we want to promote responsible innovation. So I think this study, the interrelationship between all these principles is going to be critical going forward.
Thank you, Shanaz. I just want to start with responding to a few comments that my panelists, colleagues made. So, Aman, I think what you said was, is privacy equal to AI regulation? And I think to a large extent I agree with you, but it is not. I don't think it's equal. I think it's foundational, right? So, unless we get that element right, wherever AI regulation has to be built, AI regulation will not work. So I think that's point number one. But the next point that I'm trying to, or I'm observing, or I'm hearing, or our company is experiencing is that globally, AI regulation is sort of swinging back in the pendulum of rigid regulation. I think it's coming away from that perception of, oh, AI is going to hurt us, AI is going to be harmful, to the point where we need to allow AI to innovate and to be creative. I think the biggest change has been what happened in EU, right? With the EU Act sort of getting diluted, the AI are getting diluted, and I think that comes out of a very negative experience that the EU had with GDPR. Because when GDPR got enacted, it essentially killed the data economy. And if you look at the largest data companies in the world, they're all probably American or from somewhere else. So I think there are some thoughts around that, if we start coming up with rigid AI regulations, it will essentially kill the baby in the crib, and we won't really have any other AI companies. But also it's important, and we've been having a lot of discussion in various forums, not just this one, but there's been GPA, there's Carnegie, and there's been other forums across the world. We really don't know how to regulate AI. I think that's very important. We may have the intention to do it, but how do we go out and do it? Even in the case of very specific use cases of, let's say, deepfakes, right? How does one effectively regulate deepfakes without really killing the entire industry around creation, right? The other element that is important is India's approach to AI, because now the conversation of AI has become all about LLMs, or at least for the near future, it will be around LLMs. And it is really expensive, really resource intensive to create an LLM from scratch. There are some companies that are doing it, but eventually that is not the space where most companies will play. It will be around very specialized, very specific niche LLMs or innovation use cases. Most people will experience AI through their brands, through their companies. So when I interact with an e-commerce company or a product company, that's where I will interface with AI. Right? It's not me interacting with ChatGPT or DALL-E or Stability directly. It's going to be through these companies. And it is important to understand that here, data is important, and that's where the privacy angle or regulation, if there is any regulation around non-personal data, around anonymization, that's where it takes precedence. And it's also important to note that in the enterprise space, unless we get some of these things really sorted out, it's not going to work. Nobody's going to buy anybody's products. You're not, if you're a company, let's say Mahindra, you're not going to invest in an AI that's not tested and tried. You rather wait for that cycle to develop and then get onto the bandwagon, because your reputation is much more valuable than just experimenting with something that's not tested in. I'll stop here, but I think there's some very interesting points this panel will discuss.
Thanks everyone for your opening remarks. I think a common theme that I picked up, which is maybe an area of ambiguity, I can call it, is how data protection principles and regulation extend to AI technologies, right? How are they applicable? So Aman, I'll come to you with this question. Are there any emerging trends that you've identified in data protection regulations, not just in India but globally as well, which you think can impact AI innovation positively or negatively?
Sure. Have I picked up the wrong thing? Yeah, thanks for that question, Shravani. And maybe before I just get to that, just maybe adding to what Vivek was saying, I don't think the point I was trying to make is that it's the privacy regulation is going to be the be-all and end-all, but it is a very important component of this. And in fact, the fact is that we already do have privacy frameworks which exist. So as we are thinking through what AI regulation looks like, the privacy or the data protection legislations are an important part of that, right? And how they interact with the development of the technology, or even if we need to reimagine some of the data protection principles that exist in the context of AI, is going to be fairly critical. And I might give a few examples as I go ahead, but maybe in terms of trends or which way we're seeing things going, I'll give a few examples, right? Like I think everyone's familiar with what happened to ChatGPT in Italy, where it got banned temporarily earlier this year. And what that compelled OpenAI to do is to bring about some changes in their privacy policy. One, to be a little bit more transparent about where they were sourcing data, how they were doing it, and two, create the ability for users whose data was perhaps part of the training data sets to seek that removal. Now, again, that creates certain challenges, I think, and I think this conversation even came up back when blockchain was the talk of the town, that how do you delete or enforce user rights in a world where things are immutable? So how do you do that in a world where a model is already trained? And I think regulators are also cognizant of that fact, and as long as you're achieving the outcome that they're hoping for, which is like preventing harm to users, allowing us to exercise some degree of control over our data, I think regulators are going to be receptive and open, right? Which is why we saw ChatGPT come back, but it also taught lessons to people who are developing in this space, right? That factoring in privacy into your product development is a very important part of this. And as you were saying, business will not work unless you're compliant in this space, right? So that was kind of the earliest trigger we see this year. I think another interesting outcome of the technology evolving at the speed at which it is if you take the US executive order, one of the things it calls for is to really, it pushes for a federal privacy regulation which doesn't exist in the US at all. So it's interesting that the technology and the rate at which it is growing is in fact compelling, or at least putting out a thought there in a jurisdiction which is historically like, there have been conversations around the federal privacy legislation for so long, but this is coming through a push from an executive order. I think that's an interesting sign or a trend that we can look into. And the third trend I wanted to point out is, again, in light of what happened in Italy, we've seen regulators in a bunch of other European jurisdictions. So both the French privacy regulators, CNIL, and the UK ICO have come out with fairly detailed guidance and toolkits on how, as an AI company, do you account for privacy in your products, right? And I think that speaks to the point that I don't think regulators are viewing this as a either or a blocker, very open to the fact that, or clear on the fact that innovation is important. But how do we get there in a manner which accounts for privacy principles? And there are going to be challenges in that. I don't think those toolkits are perfect. They assume capabilities beyond what exists perhaps today. But that willingness, I think, on the regulatory side, I think is a positive message, and something that India can certainly learn from.
Thanks, Aman. I think one of the principles you touched upon is the idea of transparency, right? And this is something that all of you mentioned in your opening remarks as well, is that there are data protection specific expectations and principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, retention or storage limitation. So Karthik and Shahnaz, I'll come to you with this particular question. So how do these data protection principles apply in the context of AI technologies, especially with the new wave of generative AI technologies, right? How do you ensure that there is storage limitation? How do you ensure that there is data minimization for that matter, right?
Perfect. Let me start. So one of the key areas that we are saying that especially generative AI is talking or having interactions with the data privacy principle, especially when it comes to biases, is that the kind of trials that have happened have shown that the biases, if it exists, it gets cemented. So it's very important that when we are having those AI algorithms being tested, we are able to at least remove those biases, or at least see that, okay, identify that there are biases which are existing. Also in generative AI, we must understand that AI is an algorithm or software which is doing its job. People who are designing it are the people who are actually creating those structure around it as to how that algorithm needs to work. If that algorithm, I'll just give you a simple example, if an algorithm is to make sure that this particular AI used in a classroom setting over a period of time will ensure that there would be 100% of people who will pass in that classroom. Given around about 50 people who have registered for that class, AI starts teaching. AI understands that there are about 20 people who are really good, they will pass definitely. Then it identifies there are 5 people who really need to work upon, and they are not able to because the AI is testing at periodic intervals. Later it finds out that, okay, these 5 who need special care, I am giving them all the content, but still they are not improving the scores. And my requirement from the person who made me is that I need 100% people to pass this class. In one fine day, he understands that because one of the guys got so frustrated with the regular low scores, he just dropped out of the class. AI got a new thing. It's a generative AI. Generative AI understood that, okay, if these 5 people just get eliminated from this class, I will get the target. That's 100% of people passing the class. So the next time, the questions which are coming to these 5 or 4 individuals now there are actually very hard, and it becomes so frustrating, all 4 of them quit. And then AI achieves, and AI actually goes back and says, yes, I am that program now, which can actually lead to 100% of class performance. So it met the requirement, but a bias got cemented. Right? So these are the areas where we need to understand that how we are making sure that some privacy principles, transparency, what that algorithm was, is it auditable? Do we even have auditors who can audit and assure that the AI has no biases of that nature? We are also talking about data minimization. These AI are actually using sets from other scraping, social media. Those scripts are also now coming and diluting the database which is used for these LLMs, which is basically giving AI potential power to cross-reference these data sets and ensure that there is more insights which are being given at all times, and which is where generative AI is now becoming a problem to some extent, and we must address that as soon as possible with AI governance.
I think Karthik sort of addressed a lot of these points, but I think as I said in my opening remarks, there are going to be some frictions when we talk about the data protection principles and applying it in the AI context. If you say purpose limitation, how does it apply to an AI system whose idea is to self-learn? And you say data minimization, how does it apply to an AI system which is supposed to get itself trained on a huge chunk of data? How do rights like right to erasure, right to updation work in an AI ecosystem where there is somehow a lack of explainability, where the developer or the manufacturer may itself not really be aware? So yeah, there are frictions, but is this concerning? I honestly don't think, because I feel like the law is always going to play a catch-up to technology. So obviously your privacy law, data protection laws is never going to have an answer. There will be some frictions. But as Aman also pointed out, regulators in different countries are now slowly trying to realize that, perhaps there is also a need to come up with guidance and help the industry to figure out how perhaps they can design AI systems in this data protection framework. No matter, despite the frictions that we see today, there is a data protection law in the country. It has been enacted, it will be notified soon. So everyone who's processing personal data has to comply with it. The regulator's job will be to ensure that there are standards, that there are guidance that comes out, which will allow the innovation to still happen despite certain requirements of privacy that are there. And it is also for the industry to figure out that that they have to be more responsible in how they are designing designing AI systems. Let's say you have to know what kind of data that is being used. You have to think about different perhaps privacy enhancing technologies. You have to perhaps consider anonymization. So I think there has to be an exploration of techno-legal measures going forward to ensure that AI systems can also sort of work in this data protection framework that we have. And of course, going forward, I'm sure we might see a legal framework which again will be relevant from an AI deployment and design perspective. Thanks. Vivek, do you want to add something?
Yeah. So I just want to reiterate my point that I made in my introduction. I think a lot of this friction will get resolved by market forces, because essentially what we are seeing is that large enterprises are not going to go for AIs where you cannot demonstrate that you have weeded out bias, toxicity, and you don't have ability to audit and correct and remove hallucinations. But I just want to paint another picture here, So for example, we fast forward a few months in the future, and we start looking at new wave of companies that are sort of innovating on AI, and The only way to innovate on AI is, sort of pick on what Karthik said, is to really start introducing new data or data that is not available on the internet. Because most, if not all, LLMs are trained on the internet, right? So you have to innovate by getting proprietary data or closed databases that are not accessible on the internet. So let's say I am ChatGPT Finance and I want to make a ChatGPT that's specific to finance. I go to a financial company, let's say JP Morgan, right? I'm using these names very arbitrarily, there's nothing to do with anything else. But let's say they go to JP Morgan and say, hey, let's co-create a model that will be tailored to finance. It will be useful to you, it will be useful to anybody else who's going to target customers of a certain category who can be receptive to loans, etc. JP Morgan says, great, I'm happy to give you my data. I'll charge you $50 million for this training data set, and we'll sort of share the revenues 50-50. Now, the one big concern that JP Morgan will have is that, hey, if I'm sharing de-anonymized or personal data, I have a big concern that maybe through the model somebody's able to crack that personal data, right? You have seen instances where they've been able to do that, okay? Now, JP Morgan puts in an agreement saying that if there is any situation where my customer personal data gets leaked out, you, as ChatGPT Finance, have to make good any liability damages that fall on me, which could run in the tune of millions of dollars. Now, ChatGPT Finance has no other option but to agree to that. They go and refinance it in the insurance market, that's a whole other thing. But these things, these kind of unequal liability agreements can only happen in the state of New York or in New York City, certain Wall Street situations, right? And it's based on a very specific swap contract that happens there. Nowhere else in the world, my point is this, nowhere else in the world can such a contract be created. If you transplant this same situation between, let's say, a travel innovation app over here, for argument's sake, Make My Trip, who wants to take data from IRCTC, which is sitting on years of travel data, that transaction is not going to happen, right? So what ends up happening is they get priced out of the market by some other international innovators saying that I've got proprietary data from abroad, but I don't have any data, but I at least have proprietary data from abroad, and I start giving you travel itineraries which are much better than your generic internet available public data based models. So what do? What I'm trying to build to is, there's a conversation that's going on to build DPI for data, all right? Where you allow the account aggregator framework to sort of get extended, and you get data providers and data consumers to come in a confidential clean room, a digital confidential clean room. Model gets trained on the data that's provided. You can have multiple companies bring in the data, and that's also a huge risk for a data provider, because by myself, I may be providing de-anonymized data, but combined with the data set from a third or fourth company, it could be, anonymized data, and from a third or fourth company, it could be de-anonymized whole. But using this confidential clean room, I can computationally guarantee that the model doesn't walk back with any data. It only walks back with inferences, right? Now that's a huge key to unlock data markets in the country. Now, do we need regulations to enforce this? No, because by engaging with the system, you're already following the rules. You're already following privacy first, security first, you're sort of looking at those. My point is, I think it's time to start looking at innovative models. It's inefficient to start solving problems or look at solving problems only through regulation. I think we need to start looking at technology as well. I think AI for AI is an important concept that we need to talk more about.
Thanks, Vivek. I have a quick follow-up question for you on that. So,
Sure.
you mentioned all the different stakeholders that are involved in this, right? From the entities, the provider of the data, to the ultimate developer of an AI model, right? So, in that process, in that supply chain, how do you fix accountability and who's responsible for what along the process, right?
It's a very, very important and complex complex question. I don't think I have the right answer to that, but let me sort of color another picture for you, right? Um, we are in a, Salesforce is in a very unique position today because not only are we consumers of AI personally as a company, but we are also provision of providers of those AI models or enablers of those AI models for our customers. So when a customer comes to our company, they say, hey, we don't want to use a Salesforce LLM, we want to use the 10 different LLMs that are in the market, or we want to use our own LLM, we enable that. I believe, or we believe, that a lot of companies will be, or most companies operating in the AI space will essentially conform to this model where there will be a pass-through for a foundational model that is already there in the market. It is too expensive, it is too inefficient to start looking at building your own LLM for each use case that you start looking to market, right? So you essentially then have to think about, okay, where does the responsibility of the foundational model end? The foundational model creator end? Where is the responsibility of the person who's enabling access to that begins? Where does the consumer's responsibility begin? Right? Who provides what training data? Because the training data is coming from different sources. It's not at the foundation level only. It's also at the proprietary level where when I'm providing as Salesforce to a consumer, the enterprise customer essentially is bringing their data into the model as well. So there is some level of filtration, there's some level of weeding out, bias removal, etc. that needs to be done at that stage. So I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had. I don't think we have all the answers, but it's important to acknowledge that it's not very simple model creators and model consumers. There's a whole lot of other ecosystem providers that are going to be there, and I think those are going to dominate the ecosystem as compared to the utility scale foundational model creators in the future.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about AI for AI and the idea of technological innovation as a modality to adhere to accountability, transparency obligations, right? So this is a question to the entire panel, whoever wants to contribute to this. How can enterprises and businesses that are now adopting AI technologies into their business processes, right? How can they leverage the benefits of AI tools and technologies while complying with their data protection obligations that are there? So what are things that they should keep in mind? What are interventions that they should make?
So I feel one of the key things, and I think a lot of companies who we are consulting with in Bazaar, so we are looking at companies looking into AI governance frameworks. So as in privacy, we all remember that we have data privacy frameworks, and from there everything is to flow till the time DPO operationalizes privacy in their companies. So similarly, AI governance framework is something which is the starting point that we see with a lot of companies who have adopted AI and started talking about AI, using AI. I wanted to respond to Vivek's one of the point that was around these roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders. I think that is very well covered with AI governance framework, like we see in other data protection frameworks, the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders being identified. Also ensuring the sub-processor, data controllers, processor role in regulation. So all of those similar in drawing parallel to what data protection frameworks are. In AI governance framework, various actors of that chain are very clearly demarcated. They need to adhere to certain rules and regulations which are coming from the governance framework itself. There are ways in which you can go and audit an organization around that AI governance. AI for AI, I beg to differ a bit. I think that there needs to be a human intervention when it comes to AI. And I'm taking a leap out of the ethics part of it. We don't want to be governed by AI at any point of time in our lifetimes. And there is a generative AI, then there is AIG, which has come up, and it has its own new nuances. A lot of people are talking about it could be maybe eradicating human species from the planet. But I think that we need to look into these subjects more carefully, ensure that what is that AI governance that we want to put in. I think that AI cannot govern itself. They need humans to govern AI, and that's where their capacity and capability needs to be built in.
Just very briefly, Actually, I think the question was, how well can you utilize technology as you're thinking through compliance with data privacy regulations? I think technology has a huge role to play in that, right? I think Vivek, you spoke about anonymization tools. So I mean that's an obvious starting point. Do you even need personal data for the model training that you're going to do? If you don't, then use a solution which allows you to anonymize it to the best standard that's available, right? De-anonymization risks always will exist. That's something that we can't ever completely eradicate, I think, but technology has a solution to offer, on that side of things. The other conversation that I'm not fully clued in on this as yet, but there's a lot of talk about the ability to use AI to create synthetic data, which can then be used to, train new models. So you're getting, again, kind of sidestepping the privacy or the data protection problem by using technology in a way which allows you to create data sets which still will allow you to draw inferences which mimic the real world without putting real world data at risk or within that honeypot of data which is one of the concerns, right? So I think more like thinking will evolve on this. And maybe just a quick question to Vivek on the accountability piece. Do you think eventually market forces are going to solve for that as well, or not? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on why.
No, I think to a large extent, yes, but you will always need basic regulations on high-risk use cases, right? So things like defense or pharma or bio, you need to have some basic regulations in place to ensure that you know what harms are in the cyberspace or how do they translate in the real world. I think those level of foundation stuff, yes, we probably need to have. I don't think, or let me put it this way, I don't think any government is really thinking a regulation at that level is not going to happen. It is, I think everybody's thinking around that. I think market forces will solve for things like, Netflix recommendations or loan recommendations or school admissions or employment recommendations, things like that, at a very low impact, low risk, low harm. I mean, significant harm, but yeah, it's low risk and not like bodily harm. I think at that level, I think market forces will play a very, very big role. But I just want to respond to what Karthikeya said about AI harms, and whether humans should be in the loop or not. I'm not saying that humans shouldn't be in the loop, but I just want to say the way we've been looking at technology in this country and everywhere else is, if you want more ethics, you need to have more digitization. You need to have more faceless, you need to have more technology. There is inherent bias in human decisions, there's inherent potential for corruption, and every time there's a human ability to make decisions, be it the gold prices, the FX currency prices, or the LIBOR rate scandal, there's always been corruption. So is it always undesirable to have only technology in the decision making? Look, I would question that. I think we need to have maybe a case by case conversation, or at least classes of cases where we need to think about human or not human.
Yeah, I sort of agree with what a lot of the panelists said, but this question about accountability sort of always comes up. And there are different types of AI. LLMs is like one of them, but today, let's talk about automated decision-making systems, right? The kind of risks, so a risk-based approach obviously is sort of is something that we need to account for, while there might be a human involvement also, even in the case of perhaps an automated decision-making system. But the question, there is always a fear or a concern around automation bias also that is there. So I think for regulators going forward, identifying or pinpointing the points of regulation is going to be tricky. And who are the actors in the supply chain who might actually have to comply with whatever the law may be, whenever there is a harm. I think that those are important questions to consider. So if you look at now EU is reconsidering their product liability directive to bring in certain kinds of autonomous products there, and they are looking at who are the different actors in the supply chain that perhaps may have to be accounted for when a consumer files a claim for harm against an autonomous product. Obviously, it's an evolving discussion, who's right, who's wrong. I mean, there can always be debates about it, but I think these questions will become more prominent as we move forward with newer use cases of AI, which will actually have a significant legal impact on a user. So right now, perhaps generative AI is still sort of exploring use cases. The moment it starts having significant legal consequences for an individual and questions of harms arise, I think questions of attribution of liability and points of regulation will have to be very seriously considered and clarified.
Just want to give an example of that, very interesting one. So there was a conversation, and it was on AI. I was on panel somewhere, and the discussion went on that there was this in the CM office. The CM was sitting, and one of the officers got a due letter, which has to be written to the Prime Minister office. And it took some time for him to get that due letter done. And the CM in his mockingly said that this could have done by ChatGPT in a click of a button. I could have sent it out to the PM office, and why did you take so much time? The conversation went on, and it happened that the officer responded that, sir, that's fine, you can take a ChatGPT letter out in a second and send it across, but if there's an issue or a concern with that, will you take the accountability when the Prime Minister office writes back to you? So on the part of accountability. So it's okay, you use ChatGPT, everything, but then in the end, who is accountable? And that's where the question is. And that's where the regulators are now actually getting into the supply chain and other areas, saying who needs to be held accountable for that, especially those drawings, deepfakes, whatever creative content we are launching into the network. Yes?
Thanks, Karthik. So I think in the interest of time, I'll now ask everyone to quickly give their closing remarks, right? We've touched upon ethical principles of AI, we've touched upon data protection principles, their intersections, and the different global approaches to actually applying this in practice, right? So going forward, when we're thinking about India's approach to AI regulation, data protection regulation, which of course has already started, right? So what role can, this is a two-part question, what role can the industry play in shaping these discussions and policy making around AI and data protection? And then what should be India's specific approach, right? We know there's a EU right-centric approach, there's a different approach that the US is taking, Singapore has its own approach. So what is, or what should be rather India's approach to this? So just quick 2 minutes closing remarks from each of you, and then we'll take questions.
Okay. Just wanted to highlight two things. One is that Singapore took that name because that is where I wanted to close. I saw the way in 2022 to 2024, the kind of regulations that Singapore came out with AI. If you see the global index on AI that is mentioned by tortoise media to go back, you see that the phenomenal jump of Singapore to right now very nearing to fourth or third on that index from 10th, even below in previous years, has been because of the regulation which came in and the kind of environment it created for AI to now really be out there, even in their DPIs and even in the industry. So what I feel India, and this is coming from whatever I could hear from the G5 summit also, that we are right now on 14th rank on that index, by the way. So we need to make sure that we have a regulation in place, the way DPDPA we have. The regulation should only give safeguard guardrails for the technology to further encourage startups to get on with AI, make those synthetic data, those use cases, provide that impetus to the industry to go on and really face the new challenges that we are being faced with. We are seeing cyber for AI in cyber nowadays, the kind of ransomware attacks and really attacks which are phenomenal and every day happening. There is AI in cyber which is helping on the other side to stopping it, contain it, and then further regulating it. So I feel that AI has a lot of potential. We need the right regulation, especially to jump at least in the top 3 in that index.
Just 2 points. I think from a regulatory point of view, I think going forward, we have to be clear in terms of what is the objective objective of our regulation? I mean, what are we trying to regulate? We don't want to regulate the technology, right? We want to regulate an outcome. So we have to be very clear about the kind of digital rights that we have. We have to be very clear about the kind of digital harms that we are trying to regulate. So I think that sort of clarity has to be there, because it cannot be that, let's regulate AI. So that's one point. Second point, I feel that, while, there have always been discussions around about EU's approach, India, given the state of our economy, given the state of our startup ecosystem, I feel that, perhaps a comprehensive legislation is not the way forward for India. Also the penetration of AI in different sectors and the use cases, the risks might be different. So perhaps it might be useful for sectoral regulators to start off conversations. Like if you look at countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, you have the industry associations working with regulators to understand or design practices what responsible AI will mean for a particular sector, let's say in the financial sector, and I think that might be a better way to start the conversation, so that we have at least some baseline consistent standards of how, as an industry and as a government and as a nation, we interpret what responsible AI means for us. So yeah, that's my
I think we'll make the last word. Since Shenar, I think I agree broadly on what you said about the AI regulation piece. Since this is a panel on the intersection of the data protection and AI piece, I'll speak a little bit about even some of the messaging that's come out through our data protection law, and where I feel that there is an opportunity for India to do more and do better. So if you look at the DPDPA, it does two interesting things, right? One, it carves out an exemption for publicly available data from pretty much the scope of the law, which is unlike any other privacy regulation we've seen anywhere in the world. And the intention seems very much to enable AI innovation by allowing the pretty much wide-scale scraping of publicly available information. But I think as lawyers who are trying to interpret this provision, we feel it's a tricky one. I don't know if we'll ever be able to give people that confidence that what is publicly available today reveals that. What is the bounds of that? Is if it's behind a registration, is it still publicly available? I mean, there are nuances to that question, and also as a citizen and as someone whose data is out there, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that reading itself, right? So that's a strong message that comes out through this regulation, that we are trying to be pro AI innovation. On the other hand, the regulation is very consent-centric, and consent in the context of AI may not be the best legal basis for processing, right? I mean, even I mentioned toolkits from other jurisdictions where they're talking about how can you innovate while respecting privacy principles. A lot of time is spent in those on determining the right legal basis for processing for the activities that you're undertaking. And I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity in India. I mean, we'll have to maybe do creative interpretations of the exemptions within the law to allow for some, to have the ability to do some of this innovation outside of this consent framework. And I think just, I mean, to your first question of what's the role that the industry can play, there is going to be a massive, I mean, it's going to be critical for the industry to sort of participate in this conversation and also help kind of set standards where both users and regulators feel comfortable in the manner in which innovation is happening. Because I think for the wide-scale adoption, again, that trust and aspect is going to be critical, which will only come through when people and regulators feel as though their data is kind of being responsibly managed.
Thanks, Aman. I don't have a lot to add. I think you've pretty well covered between the three of you. Just add a couple of small points. One is, what I do foresee in the future, in the near future, is some of the tactical challenges around implementing the data protection rules or intents while processing for it. So things like consent is going to be a major engineering challenge for a lot of us, especially companies or entities that are sitting on bucket loads of data that they have collected in the past. And I think, offering services that has AI ingrained in it, I think it's going to be requires a little bit of thinking on our part. But I just want to also pick up on one point that Shanaz made is regulating for outcomes, and I think it's a good conversation to have. We must very well clarify what is it that we're regulating, because we can either regulate the process, and there has been some thinking and conversation around ethical development and secure development, etc., 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 and it carries you to a certain extent. But regulation for outcomes is a very, very difficult task, and anybody who doesn't think it is should watch this video called the AI Dilemma on YouTube, and you'll have a good sense of what I'm talking about. It's impossible to know how AI can be used or will be used, and you essentially have to wait for it to happen till it happens. So, I think have an active conversation with industry, see how trends are moving, and really act quickly if it's leading to something very harmful. The third point is, having said that, probably there isn't a lot of market for new LLMs. I think India has a scope, or has the scope to make a few LLMs or more that are tailored to India. A lot of the data that on the internet, 90% upwards, is not Indian data, right? It's not local languages. It's not our way of looking at the world. It's a very Western-centric way of looking at the world. So our perspectives, our biological data, our views, etc., are not captured in the foundational model. So when we start writing things like editorials, letters, etc., through ChatGPT, it will not reflect what the Indian mentality is, what the Indian culture is. And I think that's an important aspect that we need to start capturing. And I think some companies have started doing that, but the essential element is data collection. And a lot of that data doesn't exist in any database. So that, I think a lot of investment thinking needs to be done on how do we capture that latent data that is there in the population and sort of surface it so that we can build AI models around it. And I know that.
Thanks for that, Vivek. Do we have any questions in the audience? We have about 7 or 8 minutes.
Hi. So just allow me some time because my question might be then, because I have been roaming, right? Now all people are talking about the technology, AI, and data, everything, right? So when we ask about the ransomware people who are trying to protect the data, what they will say that you should have a backup somewhere. And when we talk about the backup people, they said the data should be encrypted, right? Now you are talking about the AI model, right? Now my question is, let's say that there are an organization who has a petabyte of data, and if the data has been encrypted, how that AI will go and do the discovery of the data, which is based on the regulatory compliance? This is one question. Second question, there is like structured and unstructured data. Unstructured data, yes, it can be discovered because definitely it is there, right? And then you talk about the people, human and AI, right? So what he pointed out is right, because what I feel is, if I am talking to the right people, the admin team, the IT admin team will be knowing that they have some data where it is data, right? But the developer team will be exact team who will know that where exactly they are storing the data, right? So there are like a lot of confusion where exactly need to search it, how that regulatory will compliance, and those things, right? So but still people are adopting the AI, this thing, the privacy model, and they are implementing the tool, right? So my question is, are the people trying to just satisfy their ego, saying that we are regulatory compliance by discovering the data which is only discoverable, but what about the data which is not discoverable, right? Which they might don't know where exactly the data, but they say we know the data where it is. What my point?
I didn't get the second question, but I can answer to the first one, and maybe you can elaborate on the second question. The first one, essentially, there are technology available even now. So, for example, when we store data in our databases, it's encrypted at rest. It's also encrypted in motion. So there is a way to decrypt it on the fly and use it because you need to do that to do visualizations, to do analysis. And look, AI is not new. We've been dealing with AI for the last 20 years. AI is already there in all of these systems. So it's not that training has never happened with encryption. There is already, this is standard stuff, this is known. Okay, on your second question, I'm not very clear, but I think it's something to do around humans and AI.
No, the thing is, see, when you said that, the in motion, the encrypted data can be, I know that, I can understand that. But again, when you say that, the data in a motion, which is the encrypted data, the technology has to read it, right? So that means you have to provide the key to the tool which is trying to decrypt your data. That means again, you are exposing your key to the tool, which in case, and that means that the person who is uploading your the encrypted public key or maybe the private key, that person has to be trusted, right? So that means you are exposing everything, right? Exposing everything to the technology.
No, that's not true. I think that's where the misconception is. You don't need to do it. You can do visualizations, you can do decryptions on the fly and ensure that in motion encryption happens. But you can only pick the insights that you need, and you can do the analysis or the training and let the data remain in encryption. So I understand what you're saying. There are ways to do it, and it's already in deployment.
So I have a small question. First of all, applause to the team out here, including Aman, Shehnaz, Vivek, and Karthikeyan. We come from the government, right? So the government agency where we are, we just aren't allowed to expose the data anywhere. Now we've been calling loads of people for the POCs to get the things. All industry guys are trying to help us out. So it's a common question to everyone, and everybody's mind talks about the same thing, that how do we take care of our data? Because the data is not supposed to be revealed to anyone. It's just a subset of what his question is. But my problem is the government agencies. How do we reveal for the LLMs and the simple AI chatbot? If not, I want to prepare an AI chatbot, I need to have the data, and I need to have certain kind of confidential data, unclassified data, which I can be given to the people around, and it could be like a PDFs, and the generation of the questionnaires can be generated and a lot of things. Government agencies are not allowed to do that also. Is there any kind of a way where we are able to do LLMs and various other protocols which we should be able to use and try to make kind of a things which are readily available on the customized board in order to make it in our kind of a system together? So this is the major problem which we are facing, number one. Number two is, it's just a club one. Till the time there's a graduation of the things happening around, from the point of the AI getting boomed up, it's going as a beautiful jargon, and everywhere it's being used, there's no doubts about it. And Tesla being tested outside, and then things coming up on the auto shoot mechanism, the way the target mechanism is taking place in the Indian military also. Today the most important question is whether you want to blame it onto the algorithm, whether you want to blame it onto the person. The innocents are losing their lives because of that. So what exactly the nuances of that? I know it's a very, very nascent state, but how it is exactly like how you transfer yourself from the legacy to the main new generation outlook today. So during the transition phase, how do we take care of that in our systems? Thank you very much.
Yeah, you want to let me just start with it, and maybe then definitely Vivek would add to. So when it comes to government, I feel that this question was there when PDPV 2019 was being discussed at length. It was a very comprehensive law and very structured in a fashion. DSCI has been in the works with them for a very long time. So one of the reasons, you also remember that there was a non-personal data which was being discussed at a lot of times, that whether it should be, should not be a part of the privacy bill and all that. So the reason where non-personal data was coming was the impetus coming from the smart cities. There's so much of data which is being captured and used in these smart cities, with the 100 smart cities that the government had already launched, that there was, so what to do with that data? Because now that data needs to be used in various ways, or may not be just monetize it, but actually used in algorithms where we can actually serve the public welfare. And a very simple case of having the guy who collects the garbage at the right address at the right time. And he needs address of that guy. He needs that name and maybe some kind of an ID, maybe a municipality ID or something, to say that yes, I have collected the garbage. So these kind of things which were being discussed. So how much of non-personal data should be a part of the AMP? Then later on, this whole conversation went on till the time when the DPDPA Act was being discussed in January, that as was very well mentioned by Aman also, that even the publicly available data was put out of the ambit of DPDPA. So we said that personal data, we know it's personal data, but that personal data is publicly available. And that's where the whole conversation went on, saying that, okay, this means that government is in the works of actually using this data later to solve larger problems. And that's where we also got a rank of 14 when we went into the AI governance ranking, and we said that these are the areas where we are very transparent with our citizens. We are saying that we are a citizen-centric government for the public welfare, and we'll be using your data. But definitely there will be processing where we'll be doing it transparently, like when you go and get your DL done or some kind of a registry done. So they are using your personal data at all times. But then what is that benefit that you get? You get something which is non-reputable. It is having a digital signature, seal, it cannot be fake. So people understand that for the benefit of the public welfare, the data can be used. LLMs, ChatGPT, I had a conversation where a lot of these digital libraries are coming up. Now that digital libraries have data which can be used for very specific reasons for that particular state government or that department to use all of that records. Immediately they should know what referencing it has done. So that's where it's a difference from ChatGPT or model AI-led, where they want referencing also to be done. So those kind of conversations are there in the works. I think that it's only a matter of time when we see a Bhashni kind of a thing coming up, where we say that an LLM is there, which is Bharat-oriented LLM, can be used publicly as well as for the government departments. Over to you.
Thanks, Karthikeyan. So, just to add to what he said, it's not just personal data that you are worried about, it's non-personal insights on different stuff. First of all, I want to say yours is not a unique problem. It's not just a government problem, companies also have the same problem. If you order something from an e-commerce or any big e-commerce company, especially the one starting with A, and if you get your notifications in Gmail, you'll see that there's no product information, there's no order information, it's just there's one button to sort of click and then go and see the information on the app. Now the reason why they're doing it is because they don't want Gmail's or Google's AI to start training on the data that they are sort of putting, right? What my point is, there are ways to do it, okay? There are ways where you have the foundational LLMs, you can bring in your data layer, you can secure the inferences from going into the foundational model, and you can essentially have that access control mechanism put in place so that only a privileged set of users essentially get those insights that you're looking for, okay? So if you're looking for, let's say, I don't know, board game scenarios or speeches or talking points, you can plug in those data points at the application layer. Doesn't have to really go into the foundation model, but there are inferences that it can pick up, add to what you're doing, ground it at that level, and provide you the insights that you're looking for. The second question, I think it's a very interesting philosophical question, and I always sort of look back to history on, what happens every time there's a technological innovation, right? And as you can see in the last 100 to 150 years, 250 years, we've done several such rapid technological innovations. I think one that I would like to pick out is the innovation of the automobile that happened in the beginning of the last century, right? Now, standing in 2023, that innovation is inevitable. It had to happen. But if you had lived through that era, you would also be asking the same questions. How fast do we allow the innovation of the automobile? Will it kill people in it? And probably, the numbers were high at the beginning, and we had to learn. The question is, how do we minimize it? Okay, because I don't think there is a world future today where there is no AI. AI is going to be there. We've already let it loose. There is no way, because let's say India, US, and a few other countries say, okay, AI is harmful. We don't want to use it. Do you think our neighbors in the East are going to stop? No, it's not. So you might as well do it at the same level as well, right? So there is no future scenario where AI is not going to be there. So I think the question to be asked is, how do we minimize the impact, minimize the harm, and what are the ways to think about it in such a way that we actually get more benefit out of it, and think about the right regulations for that. Yeah?
Thanks. I think we have overshot our time with this panel, but it was a really great discussion. Thank you to all our panelists and thank you to the audience for your questions. Can we have a round of applause for the panelists? Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll hand it over to Deepika to take the closing remarks.
Thank you so much to our panelists for really sharing your invaluable input for today. And please do accept a small token of gratitude. And of course, no policy track could really be complete without a discourse on AI. And that being said, going to some technical issues, I would like to revisit the cipher and next launch. So to just quickly reiterate, we had the Coalition of India for a Progressive and Holistic Encryption Regime. And then we realized that essentially a cipher, we had to rebrand it because privacy is not just a conversation for today, right? It is also a conversation for tomorrow. So next slide, please. So presenting to you a rebranded version of cipher. Next slide, please. And that's next, everyone. So next is for emerging technologies of tomorrow. So this is essentially our mandate, the new cipher mandate, where we want to expand on encryption and anonymization. And we essentially also want to touch upon various areas. It could be healthcare, it could be AI, and it could be even generative AI, as this panel really discussed. So this is our mandate for next in the future. And on that note, you might be wondering what's next, and that's essentially your lunch break. So thank you everyone again for being with us today. And see you in the next AISS.